Okay. So the things that I remember from my youth that had the biggest impact on how I thought about the world. Iran Contra as a political thing. I was in college, and I can remember watching the congressional hearings. And it was the first real political scandal since Watergate. I was 5 for Watergate, so not old enough to really remember. I do remember Nixon resigning, though. That's my first political memory, is him resigning. Anyway, I remember watching Iran Contra, and I was at a fairly liberal college, and so people were anti-Reagan because he was a very conservative president, likable but very conservative in his policies. And he seemed sort of avuncular, so you could like him even if you disagreed with him. And it felt like we'd gotten beyond the economic and social malaise of the 1970s. We were more than a decade removed from Watergate. It felt like things maybe were turning around. Even if you didn't like his politics, it felt like we were on a pretty good path. And the news broke about Iran Contra. And the thing about Iran Contra that was so troubling is that from 1979 through the end of 1980, beginning of 81, the American hostages were being held by Iran, and Iran was public enemy number 1. Like, everybody was scared of the Soviet Union, but the Iranians at the time were everybody's most hated enemy. And for President Reagan, who had been, we hate communism, and he had run on how bad the Carter administration had done their job failing to get the hostages back, to then have made this secret under-the-table deal that sold weapons to a terrorist organization to get money that could then be given to a different freedom fighter organization who turned out were probably also terrorists, but were against the communists. Everything about it was just horrible. It was like we broke every rule of who we were supposed to be fighting against, who our enemies were. And Congress had specifically said, you're not allowed to send money to the Contras in Nicaragua. They had overridden a veto. We're not doing that. So there was this congressional mandate, not allowed to do it, and they did it anyway. And before the hearings began, William Casey, who was then the CIA director, died of a brain tumor days before he was supposed to testify. So conspiracy theory, isn't that tragic if true, and did we just murder him instead so that he wouldn't have to testify? And they trotted out Oliver North, who was a Marine colonel, and he showed up to the hearing in his Marine dress uniform and raised his hand and said, I promise to tell the truth. And essentially it was, I was ordered to do this thing. And he had tears coming down his face. It was galvanizing to the American public, but it helped remind us, in case we had forgotten, how potentially corrupt the whole system was. And that the checks and balances that were in place for Congress to hold the president in check, or the courts to hold anybody in check, or, just maybe didn't work. And I don't point to that as the beginning of the moment we find ourselves in, where we can't seem to agree on anything and both sides hate each other and we can't seem to talk to people who believe different things than we do. but it certainly pushed us in that direction. Reagan was quite loved, and he was questioned about it, and the truth came out, and we sort of knew that he'd been ordered to do it, by whom and like to what end. And then when they asked the president about it, and I don't recall. And it turns out he probably didn't, because he was already suffering from some early onset dementia, memory loss. We didn't know it at the time. Kind of had a sense. But in terms of it reconfirmed the doubt we had in government during the 1970s that Reagan had kind of erased, and we started to trust a little more. And then it was gone. And then Clinton comes to power, and turns out he's a womanizer and also probably lying. But, I was at a time in my life, I'd have been 21, probably 2021 when those hearings happened. And I was very interested in government, and I was kind of naive and bright-eyed about it. And,
did it increase your, want to be more politically involved, seeing as you're a government teacher?
It decreased it.
It decreased it?
Yeah. I always assumed I would go to either state or national government and work in some capacity. That's kind of what I assumed I would do after college. And I just did not. I wasn't feeling it right afterwards. And the government teacher thing, it's not what I set out to do. And I think I rediscovered my belief that even when it's not functioning at its best, government can do good and important things. And that the art of compromise and working with people who you disagree with is fundamental to that. And it's an art form we've lost, but trying to get people to believe that the government isn't a force for bad, but can be a force for good. And I think in the last 8 years, under both administrations, that's been hard to convince people of. You as a generation your conscious lives or government as not functional. So why you would have any faith, I don't know. But that was kind of it was a dispiriting time for me. I knew I was going to school with Dick Cheney's daughters, who was then, he was then in Congress. He was about to be the Secretary of Defense. Then he was going to be Vice President. And his wife was the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So, and I knew them, and, very politically active. Liz went on to be in Congress, and I perceived myself to be headed in that direction until that event. Yeah.
Do you think that event somehow morphed American society closer to what it is today?
Yes.
In what regards?
I think this sense that everybody is corrupt is a pervasive feeling that people across the political spectrum have now. There's a presumption, I don't know that this is universally true, but I think lots of people just presume that everybody's not in it for a good reason, that they're out for however they can monetize it for themselves, and that mostly we're lying and cheating and trying to get ahead. And the thing about Watergate is that we knew that, but then, the Senate stepped in and forced him to resign, and the press did what the press was supposed to do. And as corrupt and problematic as it was, all the other institutions of society did their part to keep it from becoming worse. And nothing really happened as a result of Iran Contra. Hearings were held. We pointed out that things had gone wrong, but the only person I feel pretty comfortable saying that was ever held accountable at all was Oliver North, who went to prison for a couple of years, but it turned out okay because he got out, ran for Senate in Virginia, damn near won, in spite of all of it. And why we would within a whisper of electing
Mm-hmm.
a felon,
It seems to ring true today.
seemed incomprehensible at the time. Like, of course we would not vote for him, but 49% of Virginians voted for him for Senate. So it was closer than it had a right to be. And he went on and had, a conservative talk radio show that made him famous again and made him a lot of money. So it sort of was this, people are getting away with stuff. And I don't know that society at large points to that as that was the beginning, but it was kind of the point at which we're no longer holding people fully accountable. And I think one of the frustrations people have right now with the Trump administration is a feeling that he should have been held accountable to more than he was. And I'm sure his supporters think the same thing about Biden supporters or whatever. Just sort of this overall sense of the whole system is corrupted. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Do you think that if the information came out about the Iranian Contra Affair being a thing came out at a later date, would it have gone differently?
Like if it happened now?
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Well, like if you go to Watergate, the people that forced Nixon to resign was his own party. And while the Democrats controlled Congress when Iran Contra came out, I kind of feel like the Republicans would have still held hearings just because it was just beyond the pale what we did. It just was not okay. And now I kind of have the sense that those congressional hearings that do the oversight and the investigation feel only partisan. When the Democrats in President Trump's first term were about to impeach him the first time over his actions in then Ukraine before the war, people who were Trump supporters were convinced that it was political in nature and not grounded in any kind of fact. I think the second time more people thought it was maybe grounded in fact, but this sense that nothing that they do is anything but political, kind of. And so I think that if you did Iran Contra now, I'm not sure that they would. If it was the president's own party that controlled Congress, hearings wouldn't be held. And if it was the other party, they'd be held perpetually. When Hillary Clinton, when the attack in Benghazi happened, and the State Department certainly did not act appropriately, and the presumption that she had somehow manufactured the incident, she did a bad job, I think. The State Department did a bad job. The tragedy of American ambassador and service personnel dying in the raid on Benghazi. But, the Republicans held 13 separate hearings after it had been established she'd done a bad job. At that point, it's only political. Yeah. And it's hard to have faith in the system when the system is, it's supposed to be political, but it's not supposed to be only political. So I just think we're in a weird time, and I kind of, in my mind, I trace it back to that.
That's fair. Is there any way that you would have gone about addressing the Contra Affair if you were somehow in power at that point? Or at all?
I think that people who were in a position to order Oliver North's actions should have been held accountable. And so William Casey couldn't be because he had conveniently died of a brain tumor. Vice President, the elder Bush, testified, but nothing ever came of it. They didn't call the president because there was presumption that we shouldn't call the president, that we can't do that because it's the president. And so if the president is ordering illegal actions America needs to know about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was by definition illegal because there was a law in place to prevent that very thing from happening. Actually, multiple laws that were violated. Did a Marine colonel act entirely on his own to sell weapons, transfer funds, and outfit people fighting against communists in Nicaragua? That seems wildly implausible. There had to be some kind of Defense Department support, and I mean, other people were involved, so why are we not holding other people at a higher level to account?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I would have liked to see that happen. I don't know if that's even feasible, but it would have made more sense to me.
Would you argue that the judges weren't judicially active enough?
Well, in this case...
Or restrictive enough?
Yeah. So, in most of the cases, it never even made it to court.
Oh.
It stopped at Congress doing oversight, and the Justice Department never subpoenaed people at a higher level because they had this internal rule that says we can't bring the sitting president to trial, which I understand why that rule is in place, but the same thing applied to the vice president. We didn't look beyond who else might have been involved in any meaningful way. And again, when it was Watergate, they did. So why didn't we in Iran Contra? So yes, I would have liked to see more people held to account. If you do wrong, you should be held accountable for it. That seems like a baseline for justice, and in this case, it wasn't.
That's fair. I had a question. I forgot.
It's okay.
I was gonna say, oh yeah, going forward, do you think extra precautions such as ratifying a new law or amendment should be put in place to prevent things like this from happening?
Yes. I don't know what they look like. I don't know what the language would be. I think there has to be, one of the things that we have learned in the last 8 years is kind of a two-part answer. Whenever presidents needed to be checked, either Congress or the courts had a role to play in that regard. And they still do, but don't seem to be exercising it in a way that holds the president from wielding more power than the Constitution seems to indicate the president should have. And I think that you need to give greater authority somewhere, whether that's an independent Justice Department where the Attorney General is not appointed by the president, so isn't seen as aligned with the president, and can make independent decisions, or I don't know what it is, but I do think that that needs to be reconsidered. So the other branches ought to be more engaged. And the other thing that I think needs to happen is that we need to rely less on tradition. We've just always assumed it would work, and it did for 240 years, and now it seems to be working less effectively in terms of the branches' interactions with one another, checking each other. And I don't think it's just because President Trump is pushing the envelope. Presidents have been pushing the envelope ever since Franklin Roosevelt. But the structures and the traditions seemed to hold, and they have begun to weaken. And again, whether that's from Iran Contra forward, I don't know the answer to that, but I think you could plausibly point to that as kind of the beginning. Most people point to Watergate, but in my mind, that's an example of the system working, and Iran Contra worked less. So yes, the president, the executive branch has too much power now. It did under Biden, it did under Trump, it did under Obama and Bush the younger. It just has too much power. And Congress is largely at fault because it's not doing its job. Congress is broken. And so I don't know what needs to be done to fix that, but it needs to be fixed.
That's valid. Hold on, let me check the time. If we can come to a conclusion, that's a perfect ending. We can come to a conclusion. That's awesome.